What if I told you that behind the walls of your child home lies a secret so shocking it could rewrite everything you thought you knew about your family? Today, I'm going to share with you the most incredible true story of discovery, deception, and a photograph that exposed a 30-year lie that shattered one family forever. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old marketing executive from Portland, Oregon, who thought she was simply cleaning out her recently deceased grandmother's Victorian house when she made a discovery that would turn her entire world upside down. But before we dive into this mind-bending tale, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this one are exactly why this channel exists, to uncover the truth behind the most shocking family secrets that have remained buried for decades. Our story begins on a cold February morning in 2023. Sarah had just inherited her grandmother Eleanor's sprawling Victorian house in the historic district of Portland after Eleanor passed away at the remarkable age of 96. Eleanor Mitchell had been the family matriarch, a woman known for her sharp wit, her incredible memory, and her ability to keep the family together through thick and thin. She had lived in that house for over 70 years, raising her children there and watching their grandchildren grow up within those same walls. Sarah had always been close to her grandmother. As a child, she would spend countless hours in that house, listening to Eleanor's stories about the old days, playing in the dusty attic, and helping her tend to the massive garden that surrounded the property. But now, with Eleanor gone, the house felt different. It felt heavier, somehow as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to be discovered. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself had secrets it was waiting to reveal. The first few days of cleaning were routine. Sarah sorted through decades of accumulated belongings, old photographs, vintage clothing, books that smelled of lavender, and time. Her father, Robert Mitchell, helped when he could, but Sarah noticed he seemed uncomfortable in the house. Dad always said the house gave him the creeps, Sarah would later tell. He claimed it was just because it was old and creaky. But looking back, I think there was something else, something he was afraid we might find. It was on the fourth day of cleaning that Sarah decided to tackle the living room. This had been Eleanor's favorite room, where she would sit in her antique rocking chair and watch the world go by through the large bay windows that faced the street. The living room hadn't been redecorated since the 1970s. The wallpaper was a faded floral pattern that had probably been beautiful once, but now looked tired and outdated. Sarah decided that if she was going to keep the house, this room would need a complete makeover. As she began peeling away the old wallpaper, Sarah noticed something unusual. In one corner of the room, behind where a large bookshelf had stood for as long as she could, remember, the wallpaper seemed to be bulging slightly, as if there was something behind it. Curious, Sarah carefully peeled back the paper in that area and discovered that there was actually a small alcove in the wall, a space about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall that had been completely covered over and hidden from view. Inside this hidden space, Sarah found something that would change everything. Wrapped carefully in an old cloth and protected from dust and moisture was a photograph in an ornate silver frame, a family portrait that she had never seen before. The photograph was clearly old, probably from the 1940s based on the clothing and styling. It showed a family of 4, a man, a woman, and 2 children. The woman was unmistakably her grandmother Eleanor, but she looked young, probably in her early 20s. Standing beside Eleanor was a tall, handsome man with dark hair and kind eyes. He was holding a baby in his arms, and next to them stood a boy who looked to be about 3 or 4 years old. The family looked happy, complete, and utterly normal. But here's where the story takes its first shocking turn. Sarah recognized the little boy in the photograph immediately. It was her father, Robert, at about age 4, but the man, holding the baby, that man was a complete stranger to Sarah. Sarah knew her family history well, or at least she thought she did. Her grandfather, Eleanor's husband, had been a man named William Mitchell. William had died in a car accident in 1952 when her father Robert was only 8 years old. But this photograph had to have been taken several years before 1952, which meant that the man in the photo should have been William Mitchell, her grandfather. The problem was this man looked nothing like the few photographs Sarah had seen of William Mitchell. Sarah stared at the photograph for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Who was this man? Who was the baby he was holding? And why had this photograph been hidden away behind a wall for what must have been decades? That evening, Sarah called her father Robert and asked if he could come over to the house. She told him she had found something interesting and wanted to show it to him. Robert seemed reluctant, but agreed to come by the next morning. When Robert arrived at the house the following day, Sarah led him to the living room and handed him the photograph. She watched his face carefully as he looked at it, expecting confusion or curiosity. What she saw instead was something she had never seen in her father's face before: pure, unadulterated fear. Robert's face went completely white. His hands began to shake as he held the photograph, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might actually faint. He stared at the image for a long time without saying a word, and when he finally looked up at his daughter, his eyes were filled with tears. "Where did you find this?" Robert asked in a voice that was barely above whisper. When Sarah explained about the hidden alcove behind the wallpaper, Robert's reaction became even more intense. He began pacing around the room, running his hands through his hair, muttering things that Sarah couldn't quite understand. "Dad, what's wrong?" Sarah asked. "Who is that man in the photograph? And who's the baby he's holding?" But Robert wouldn't answer. Instead, he handed the photograph back to Sarah and said something that chilled her to the bone. "Some secrets are meant to stay buried, Sarah. Your grandmother hid this photograph for a reason. Maybe you should put it back where you found it and pretend you never saw it." Then he left the house, leaving Sarah alone with more questions than answers. But Sarah Mitchell was not the type of person to let sleeping dogs lie. If anything, her father's reaction had only intensified her curiosity. She was determined to find out the truth about this mysterious photograph and the family secret that had clearly been eating at her father for years. Sarah's first stop was the local library, where she spent hours poring over old newspapers and city records, looking for any clue that might help her identify the mysterious man in the photograph. She also reached out to elderly neighbors who had known her grandmother for decades. It was Mrs. Henderson, a 89-year-old woman who had lived next door to Eleanor for over 50 years, who provided the first real breakthrough. When Sarah showed her the photograph, Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened with recognition. "Oh my goodness," Mrs. Henderson said. "That's James Morrison. I haven't seen a picture of him in probably 40 years. He used to live in your grandmother's house, you know, back in the early 1940s, before your grandfather William came along." Mrs. Henderson went on to explain that James Morrison had been Eleanor's first husband, a fact that came as a complete shock to Sarah. As far as she knew, William Mitchell had been Eleanor's only husband. But according to Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor had been married to James Morrison first, and they had had 2 children together. "James was a wonderful man," Mrs. Henderson continued. "He was kind and gentle, and he adored Eleanor and those children. But then one day, he just disappeared. Nobody ever knew what happened to him. Eleanor never talked about it, and after she married William, it was like James Morrison had never existed. This revelation sent Sarah's mind reeling. If James Morrison was Eleanor's first husband and the father of her children, then that meant Robert wasn't William Mitchell's biological son. And if James had 2 children with Eleanor, then who was the baby in the photograph? Sarah pressed Mrs. Henderson for more details, but the elderly woman's memory was fuzzy on many of the specifics. She remembered that James had disappeared sometime, around 1946 or 1947, and that Eleanor had been devastated by his sudden absence. She waited for him for years, Mrs. Henderson recalled. She kept thinking he would come back, that there had to be some explanation, but he never did. Eventually, she met William, and they got married in 1949. William adopted the children and gave them his name. Armed with this new information, Sarah returned to her research with renewed determination. She now had a name, James Morrison, and a rough timeline of when he had disappeared. She also knew that he had been her father's biological father, a fact that her father was clearly aware of, but had never shared. Sarah's next discovery came when she decided to search through her grandmother's personal papers more thoroughly. Hidden in an old jewelry box, she found a stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. The letters were addressed to Eleanor, and they were all signed by James. Reading through these letters, Sarah began to piece together a picture of James Morrison that was very different from the mysterious figure she had been imagining. He was clearly a loving husband and father who was devoted to his family. The letters spanned several years, from the early days of James and Eleanor's marriage through to just a few weeks before his disappearance. In the final letters, James seemed worried about something, but he was vague about the details. One letter, dated just 2 weeks before James disappeared, was particularly cryptic. In it, James wrote, "My darling Eleanor, if anything should happen to me, please know that everything I've done has been to protect our family. There are forces at work that I cannot explain, but I promise you that I will find a way to come back to you and our children." The letter went on, "I've made arrangements to ensure that you and the children will be taken care of, no matter what happens to me. The papers I prepared are hidden in the place we used to hide our love letters when we were courting. If I don't return, please find them and follow the instructions I've left." Sarah's heart was racing as she read these words. What papers was James referring to? What forces was he afraid of? And most importantly, where was the hiding place he mentioned? The place where he and Eleanor used to hide their love letters? Sarah spent the rest of the day searching the house from top to bottom, looking for any other hidden compartments or secret spaces. She found several more hiding spots that contained various family mementos, but nothing that resembled the important papers James had mentioned in his letter. It wasn't until Sarah was examining the old oak tree in the backyard that she remembered something her grandmother had once told her. Eleanor had mentioned that when she was young and courting, she and her first love used to leave secret messages for each other in a hollow in the old oak tree. Sarah had always assumed Eleanor had been talking about William Mitchell, but now she realized she must have been referring to James Morrison. With her heart pounding, Sarah examined the oak tree carefully and found what she was looking for, a hollow about 6 feet up the trunk that had been carefully concealed behind a piece of bark. Inside the hollow, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the elements, Sarah found a manila envelope containing several documents. Her hands were shaking as she opened the envelope and began to examine its contents. The first document was James Morrison's will, dated just 3 days before his disappearance. In it, James left everything to Eleanor and their 2 children, Robert and a daughter named Margaret. Sarah's mind reeled at this revelation. Margaret? She had never heard of any sister or aunt named Margaret. The second document was even more shocking. It was a birth certificate for Margaret Morrison, born to James Morrison and Eleanor Morrison in March of 1944. According to the dates, this would make Margaret about 3 years younger than Robert, which meant she would be the baby in the photograph. But if Margaret was Sarah's aunt, where was she now? Why had no one ever mentioned her? Sarah continued reading through the documents, desperate for answers, and found them in a letter that James had written to Eleanor just before his disappearance. In the letter, James explained that he had gotten involved with some dangerous criminals who were using his accounting skills to help them launder money from their illegal activities. When James realized the true nature of what he was doing, he tried to extricate himself from the situation. They've threatened our family, Eleanor, James wrote. They know where we live. They know about our children. I've tried to reason with them, but they're not reasonable people. They want me to disappear, and they've made it clear that if I don't comply, something terrible will happen to you and the children. The letter continued. I've made a deal with them. I'll disappear and never contact you again, and in return, they'll leave our family alone. I know this will hurt you, and I know you'll spend years wondering what happened to me. But please understand that this is the only way I can keep you and our children safe. James went on to explain that he had arranged for Eleanor to receive a life insurance payout that would support her and the children. He had also arranged for Margaret to be taken to his sister in California, where she would be safe and could grow up under a new identity. Margaret is so young that she won't remember any of this, James wrote. It's better this way. Let her have a normal life, away from all of this danger. As for Robert, he's old. Enough that he'll remember me. But please, for his own safety, never tell him the truth about why I had to leave. The final paragraph of the letter was heartbreaking. My darling Eleanor, I know I'm asking the impossible of you. I'm asking you to let me go, to let our daughter go, and to build a new life without us. But please know that every day for the rest of my life, I will think of you and Robert. You are my heart, my soul, my everything. I love you more than words can express. Sarah sat in the backyard for a long time after reading James's letter, trying to process everything she had learned. Her grandmother Eleanor had been married before to a man who was forced to disappear to protect his family. Robert wasn't William Mitchell's biological son, and Sarah had an aunt named Margaret who was living somewhere in California under a different name. But Sarah's discoveries were far from over. Among the other documents in the envelope was a piece of paper with an address in Los Angeles and a name, Margaret Reynolds. There was also a note in Eleanor's handwriting that simply said, Maggie, Christmas 1995. This suggested that Eleanor had maintained some contact with Margaret over the hill. Years, despite James's request that they let her go completely. Sarah realized that Eleanor had kept this secret for over 70 years, taking it to her grave without ever telling anyone in the family about their missing daughter and sister. Sarah knew she had to confront her father with what she had discovered, but she also knew it would be one of the most difficult conversations of their lives. That evening, she called Robert and asked him to meet her at Eleanor's house the following day. She told him they needed to talk about the family's history. When Robert arrived the next morning, Sarah could see the anxiety written all over his face. He knew that she had been investigating, and he was clearly afraid of what she might have discovered. Sarah led him to the kitchen table and laid out all of the documents she had found. Dad, Sarah said gently, I know about James Morrison. I know he was your real father, and I know about Margaret. Robert's reaction was immediate and intense. He broke down, in tears, sobbing in a way that Sarah had never seen before. For the next several hours, Robert told Sarah the full story from his perspective. He confirmed that he had always known James Morrison was his biological father, and that he remembered James clearly, despite being only 4 years old when he disappeared. "I loved James," Robert said through his tears. "He was the best father I could have asked for. He taught me how to ride a bike. He read me bedtime stories. He took me fishing on weekends. When he disappeared, I was devastated. I kept asking Mom when Daddy was coming home, but she would just cry and tell me that Daddy had to go away." Robert explained that Eleanor had eventually told him that James had died, but she had never given him any details about how or why. When Eleanor married William Mitchell, a few years later, she asked Robert to call William Dad and to never mention James again. "William was a good man," Robert continued, "and he treated me like his own son. But I never forgot James. I had nightmares for years, wondering what had happened to him, why he had left us. Mom made it clear that talking about James was off limits, so I learned to keep my memories to myself." When Sarah asked about Margaret, Robert's expression became even more pained. He remembered his little sister clearly, how she would toddle around the house, how she would giggle when he made funny faces at her, how she would fall asleep in James's arms while he read bedtime stories. The day James disappeared, Margaret disappeared too, Robert said. Mom told me that Margaret had gone to live with relatives and that it was better for her to grow up somewhere else. I was just a little kid. I didn't understand any of it. I kept asking when Maggie was coming home, but Mom would get upset whenever I mentioned her name. Robert went on to explain that over the years, he had gradually stopped asking about Margaret. Like his memories of James, his memories of his little sister became something he kept to himself. When Eleanor married William and they started their new life together, it was as if James and Margaret had never existed. "I've spent my entire life wondering what happened to them," Robert said. "I've wondered if James was really dead, or if he was out there somewhere thinking about us. And I've wondered about Margaret, whether she was happy, whether she remembered us, whether she even knew she had a family back in Portland." Sarah showed her father the address she had found for Margaret Reynolds in Los Angeles. Robert stared at the piece of paper for a long time, his hands shaking slightly. "Do you think she's still there?" he asked. "Do you think she's still alive?" Sarah had been wondering the same thing. The address was from 1995, which meant it was nearly 30 years old. Margaret would be in her late 70s now, assuming she was still alive. There was no guarantee that she still lived at that address, or even that Margaret. Reynolds was the name she was still using, but Sarah was determined to find out. She had come this far in uncovering her family's secrets, and she wasn't going to stop now. She suggested to her father that they try to track down Margaret, and after some hesitation, Robert agreed. Sarah's first step was to hire a private investigator who specialized in finding missing persons. She provided the investigator with all of the information she had about Margaret Morrison, now Margaret Reynolds, and asked him to see what he could find. The investigator, a man named Detective Martinez, was intrigued by the case. He had handled many missing person cases over the years, but he had never worked on one where the missing person had been deliberately hidden away for protection and then lost touch with their family for decades. Within a week, Detective Martinez called Sarah with news. He had found Margaret Reynolds, and she was alive and living in a retirement community in San Diego, California. She was 79 years old, widowed, and had 3 grown children of her own. But Detective Martinez had also discovered something else that was both wonderful and heartbreaking. Margaret had been looking for her family for over 20 years. She had hired investigators of her own, but they had never been able to find any trace of Eleanor or Robert Mitchell. The reason Margaret's investigators had failed was that they had been looking for Morrison, not Mitchell. When Eleanor married William, she had changed her name and Robert's name to Mitchell, effectively erasing their connection to the Morrison family name. Detective Martinez explained that Margaret had grown up knowing that she had been adopted by her aunt, but she had always known that she had a family somewhere that she had been separated from. Her adoptive aunt had told her the basic story that her father had gotten into trouble with dangerous people and had been forced to give up his family to keep them safe. Margaret had spent years wondering about her mother Eleanor and her brother, Robert. She had fragments of memories from her early childhood, images of a big house, a woman with kind eyes, a boy who would make her laugh. But she had never been able to piece together enough information to find them. Sarah was overwhelmed by this news. Her aunt Margaret was alive, and not only that, but Margaret had been looking for them just as desperately as they were now looking for her. Detective Martinez asked if Sarah wanted him to make contact with Margaret, and Sarah said yes immediately. The initial contact was made through Detective Martinez, who called Margaret and explained that her family had been found. According to the detective, Margaret's reaction was very similar to Robert's had been. She broke down in tears and could barely speak. Detective Martinez arranged for a three-way phone call between Sarah, Robert, and Margaret. The call was scheduled for the following Sunday afternoon, giving everyone time to prepare emotionally for what would undoubtedly be an intense conversation. When Sunday arrived, Sarah and Robert sat together in Eleanor's living room, staring at the phone and wondering what they would say to the sister and aunt they had never really known. At exactly 3 p.m. Pacific time, Detective Martinez called and connected them with Margaret. The first few minutes of the conversation were awkward, with everyone crying and struggling to find words. But gradually, they began to share their memories and their stories. Margaret's voice was warm and kind, and Sarah could immediately hear the family resemblance. Margaret told them about her life in California. She had been raised by James, Morrison's sister, who was a loving and caring woman, but who had never been able to fill the hole in Margaret's heart where her original family should have been. Margaret had become a teacher, had married a wonderful man named David Reynolds, and had raised 3 children. I always felt like something was missing, Margaret said. I had a good life, don't get me wrong. My adoptive family loved me, and I loved them. But there was always this sense that I belonged somewhere else, with people who were part of me in a way that I couldn't explain. Robert shared his memories of Margaret as a toddler, and Margaret was amazed to learn details about her early life that she had never known. She remembered fragments, this big house, the oak tree in the backyard, a man who would lift her high in the air and make her squeal with delight. That was James, Robert said, our father. He loved you so much, Margaret. Remember how he would carry you around the house and sing to you. You were his little princess. Margaret cried when she heard this, finally having confirmation of memories that had been too vague and distant to trust. Sarah shared the story of how she had found the hidden photograph and all of the documents that had led to this reunion. Margaret was amazed to learn that Eleanor had kept so many mementos and records of their early life together. During the conversation, Margaret revealed something that stunned both Sarah and Robert. She still had memories of James Morrison, her biological father, that were clearer than anyone had expected. She remembered his voice, his laugh, and most importantly, she remembered the last time she saw him. He came to see me the night before he disappeared, Margaret said. I was staying at my aunt's house. I think Mom had sent me there to keep me safe while everything was happening. James appeared at my window, and he looked so sad. He picked me up and held me, and he told me that he loved me and that he had to go away for a while. Margaret's voice broke as she continued. He said that someday, when it was safe, he would come back and find me. He promised me that no matter how long it took, he would never stop loving me and thinking about me. That was the last time I ever saw him. This revelation led to a shocking discovery. Margaret had always believed, like the rest of the family, that James Morrison was dead, but her memory of that final meeting suggested that James had visited her after he had supposedly disappeared, which meant that his disappearance might not have been permanent. Sarah and Robert looked at each other with growing excitement and trepidation. If James had visited Margaret after his disappearance, then there was a possibility that he was still alive somewhere. But even if he was alive, he would be in his late 90s by now, and there was no guarantee that they would be able to find him. Margaret had one more surprise for them. She had kept a box of mementos from her childhood, including a few items that her adoptive aunt had saved from her original family. Among these items was a locket that had belonged to Eleanor, and inside the locket was a photograph of James Morrison. "I've carried this locket with me my entire life," Margaret said. "It was the only connection I had to my real family. I used to stare at the photograph and try to imagine what my father was like, what kind of man he was, whether he was still alive somewhere thinking about me." The three of them decided to meet in person as soon as possible. Margaret offered to fly to Portland, but Sarah and Robert insisted on traveling to California to meet her. They wanted to see where she had grown up and meet her family. 2 weeks later, Sarah and Robert flew to San Diego for what would be one of the most emotional reunions in family history. When they met Margaret at the airport, the recognition was immediate and overwhelming. Despite the decades that had passed, there was no mistaking the family resemblance. Margaret looked remarkably like Eleanor had in her later years, with the same kind eyes and gentle smile. But she also had features that clearly came from James Morrison, the same strong jawline and expressive eyebrows that Sarah recognized from the hidden photograph. Over the next few days, Sarah, Robert, and Margaret shared their stories, their memories, and their grief over all the years they had lost. Margaret showed them photographs of her children and grandchildren, and Sarah realized that she had cousins she had never known existed. But their reunion also opened up new questions and new avenues for investigation. Margaret's memory of James visiting her after his supposed disappearance suggested that there might be more to the story than they had discovered in Eleanor's documents. Margaret still had contact information for some of James Morrison's relatives, including the aunt who had raised her and who was now in her 90s, but still mentally sharp. They decided to visit this aunt, whose name was Ruth Morrison, to see if she could provide any additional information about James's fate. Ruth Morrison lived in a nursing home about an hour outside of Los Angeles. When Sarah, Robert, and Margaret arrived to visit her, Ruth was initially confused about who they were and why they were there. But when Margaret explained that they were trying to find out what had really happened to James, Ruth's demeanor changed dramatically. Ruth looked around the room nervously, as if checking to make sure no one was listening, and then leaned forward and spoke in a whisper. "James didn't die like everyone thinks he did. He couldn't contact his family because it wasn't safe, but he didn't die. He's been living under a different name for all these years." The revelation that James Morrison might still be alive sent shockwaves through. Ruth explained that James had indeed gotten involved with dangerous criminals who had forced him to disappear to protect his family. But instead of dying, he had assumed a new, identity and had been living in hiding ever since. He's been living in Arizona, Ruth said, working as a bookkeeper under the name John Martin. He could never contact Eleanor or the children because he was afraid that the people who forced him to disappear would find them and hurt them. Ruth went on to explain that she had been the only member of the family who had maintained contact with James over the years. She had seen him several times, and they had corresponded regularly, but always with the understanding that his true identity had to remain secret. He's been heartbroken about it his entire life, Ruth said. Every day he's wondered about Eleanor and the children. He kept hoping that someday it would be safe for him to come back, but the years just kept passing, and eventually he assumed that Eleanor had moved on and forgotten about him. Ruth had devastating news as well. James Morrison, now John Martin, was indeed still alive, but he was in poor health and living in a nursing home in Phoenix. He was 97 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia, which meant that his window for meaningful contact with his family was closing rapidly. Sarah, Robert, and Margaret looked at each other with a mixture of excitement and urgency. They had found their father after nearly 80 years, but time was running out to reconnect with him before his memory deteriorated further. Ruth provided them with contact information for the nursing home where James was living, and she called ahead to let the staff know that family members would be visiting. The nursing home administrator was initially skeptical. James Martin had been living there for 3 years, and no family members had ever visited or even called. But when Ruth explained the situation and provided documentation proving James's true identity, the administrator became much more cooperative. She explained that James rarely had visitors and spent most of his time sitting by his window, looking out at the desert landscape and rarely speaking to anyone. He seems like he's waiting for something, the administrator said. Sometimes he talks about people named Eleanor and Robert and Maggie, but we always assumed they were figments of his imagination or memories from long ago that had gotten confused. The next morning, Sarah, Robert, and Margaret drove to Phoenix to meet the Peel father and grandfather they had thought was lost forever. The drive took about 6 hours, and they spent the time sharing memories, looking at old photographs, and trying to prepare themselves emotionally for what was about to happen. When they arrived at the Sunset Manor nursing home, they were greeted by the administrator, Mrs. Garcia, who led them to a quiet sitting room where they could have privacy for their reunion. She explained that James had good days and bad days, but that he seemed to be having a relatively good day today. Mrs. Garcia brought James into the sitting room in his wheelchair. At 97, he was frail and moved slowly, but his eyes were still bright and alert. When he saw the 3 visitors waiting for him, he looked confused and a little frightened. Robert was the first to speak. His voice was shaking as he said, "Hello, James. My name is Robert. I think you might be my father." James stared at Robert for a long moment, his expression gradually changing from confusion to recognition to disbelief. "Bobby?" James whispered, using the childhood nickname that only he had ever called Robert. "Is it really you? You're so old, ... but I can see it in your eyes. You have your mother's eyes." James began to cry, and Robert knelt down beside his wheelchair and took his hand. "I'm here, Dad," Robert said through his tears. "I never forgot you. I never stopped wondering what happened to you." James reached out with a trembling hand and touched Robert's face as if he couldn't quite believe that his son was real. Margaret stepped forward next, and James's reaction was even more emotional. He stared at her for a long moment and then said, "Maggie? My little Maggie? But you're all grown up, ... You're an old lady now." Margaret laughed through her tears and said, Yes, Daddy, I'm 79 years old, but I'm still your little Maggie. James held Margaret's hand and studied her face intently. I promised I would find you, he said. I promised I would come back for you. I'm so sorry it took so long. Margaret assured him that she understood, that she knew he had been trying to protect them all. Sarah introduced herself as Robert's daughter, James's granddaughter. James was amazed to learn that he had not only found his children again, but that he had grandchildren, and great-grandchildren he had never known existed. Sarah showed him photographs on her phone of the entire extended family. Over the next several hours, James shared his story of the past 77 years. He confirmed what Ruth had told them, that he had been forced to disappear by criminals who had threatened his family, but that he had never died as everyone believed. I got involved with the wrong people, James explained. I was working as an accountant, and I thought I was just helping some businessmen with their books. But I realized they were using my work to hide money from illegal activities, gambling, smuggling, worse things. James had tried to extricate himself from the situation, but the criminals had made it clear that he knew too much to simply walk away. They gave him an ultimatum: disappear forever and never contact his family again, or watch his family suffer the consequences. They showed me photographs of Eleanor, of you and Margaret, James said to Robert. They knew where you went to school, what time Eleanor went to the grocery store, everything. They made it very clear that if I didn't cooperate, something terrible would happen to all of you. So James had agreed to disappear. He had staged his own death, assumed a new identity, and had spent the rest of his life living as John Martin, a quiet bookkeeper who never married and rarely formed close relationships with anyone, always afraid that getting too close to people might somehow endanger the family he had left behind. Every single day for 77 years, I've thought about Eleanor and you children, James said. I've wondered what you were doing, whether you were happy, whether you even remembered me. I kept hoping that someday it would be safe to come back, but the years just kept passing. James asked about Eleanor, and Robert and Margaret had to give him the yellows. Heartbreaking news that she had passed away earlier that year. James was devastated to learn that Eleanor had died without ever knowing that he was still alive and still thinking about her. But Robert was able to share something with James that brought him some comfort. He told him about all the mementos Eleanor had saved, the letters, the photographs, the documents she had hidden away. Eleanor had never forgotten James, and she had never stopped loving him. She waited for you for years before she remarried, Robert explained. And even after she married William, she kept all of your letters and pictures. I think part of her always hoped you would come back someday. James cried when he heard this, knowing that Eleanor had remained faithful to his memory, even when she had every reason to believe he was dead. The family spent the next 3 days in Phoenix, visiting with James every day, and gradually catching up on nearly 8 decades of lost time. James's memory was inconsistent. Some days he was sharp and remembered everything clearly, while other days he was confused and thought it was still the 1940s. But during his lucid moments, James was able to share stories and memories that no one else in the family had known. He told them about his own childhood, about how he had met Eleanor, about the early days of their marriage when they were young and in love, and thought they had their whole lives ahead of them. Margaret was particularly hungry for these stories, since she had grown up, knowing almost nothing about her biological parents. James was able to tell her about the day she was born, about her first steps, about the songs he used to sing to help her fall asleep. You were such a happy baby, James told Margaret. You were always laughing and babbling and reaching for everything. Eleanor used to say that you had inherited my curiosity. You always wanted to explore and discover new things. James also had questions for his children and granddaughter. He wanted to know about their lives, their careers, their families. He was amazed to learn that Robert had become a successful engineer, that Margaret had been a beloved teacher, and that Sarah was carrying on the family tradition of curiosity and investigation. On their final day in Phoenix, James asked if they could bring him something from Eleanor's house, something that had belonged to her, that he could hold and remember her by. Sarah promised that she would bring him Eleanor's wedding ring from her first marriage, the one she had worn when she was married to James. The family also made arrangements for James to receive regular visits and phone calls. Margaret, who lived closest to Phoenix, promised to visit every few weeks, and Sarah and Robert committed to calling regularly and visiting whenever they could. But they all knew that time was not on their side. James's dementia was progressing, and while he had some good days, the bad days were becoming more frequent. They were grateful beyond words to have found each other, but they were also acutely aware that their reunion had come almost too late. When it came time to say goodbye, James held each of their hands and looked into their eyes. "I need you to know something," he said. "Every decision I made, every sacrifice I made was to keep you safe. I would do it all again if I had to, because protecting my family was more important to me than anything else in the world. But I also need you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. There hasn't been a single day in 77 years that I haven't regretted having to walk away from the people I loved most in the world." Sarah, Robert, and Margaret flew back to Portland with their hearts full of joy at having found their lost family member, but also with a deep sadness at all the years that had been lost. They had found their father and grandfather, but they had also found him at the very end of his life. Back in Portland, Sarah continued her investigation into the family's history, but now with James's help and input during their regular phone calls, she was particularly interested in learning more about the criminals who had forced James to disappear and whether they might still pose any threat to the family. During one of their conversations, James provided Sarah with names and details about the criminal organization that had controlled his life for so many decades. Sarah passed this information along to Detective Martinez, who began investigating whether any of these individuals were still alive and active. What Detective Martinez discovered was both reassuring and sobering. Most of the criminals who had threatened James in the 1940s were long dead, and the organization they had belonged to had been dismantled by law enforcement in the 1960s. James had been living in hiding unnecessarily for decades. The threat that had forced him to disappear had ended long ago. This news was bittersweet for the family. On one hand, it meant that James could have safely returned to his family years earlier. On the other hand, there was no way he could have known this, and his decision to stay hidden had indeed kept his family safe during the years when the threat was real. Sarah also made another discovery during her continued investigation of the family's history. Hidden in another part of Eleanor's house, she found a diary that Eleanor had kept for decades, documenting her thoughts and feelings about James's disappearance. Reading through Eleanor's diary, Sarah learned that her grandmother had never truly believed that James was dead. Eleanor had always suspected that he was alive somewhere, and she had spent years quietly investigating his disappearance, though she had never shared her suspicions with anyone else in the family. "I know James is out there somewhere," Eleanor had written in one entry, dated 1965. "I can feel it in my heart. He didn't die in some accident or from some illness. Something happened that forced him to leave us, and someday I believe he'll find a way to come back." Eleanor's diary also revealed the depth of her ongoing love for James, even after. She had remarried and started a new life with William Mitchell. She had loved William, but James had remained the love of her life, and she had never stopped hoping for his return. The diary entries became particularly poignant as Eleanor aged and realized that she was running out of time. In one of her final entries, written just months before her death, Eleanor had written, "If James is still alive somewhere, I hope he knows that I never stopped loving him. I hope he knows that not a day has passed that I haven't thought about him and wished he was here with me." Sarah shared excerpts from Eleanor's diary with James during one of their phone calls, and his reaction was overwhelming. Learning that Eleanor had continued to love him and believe in him throughout all those years was both a source of great comfort and tremendous sadness for James. "I wish I had known," James said through his tears. "I wish I had found some way to let her know that I was alive and that I never stopped loving her either. We lost so many years together because I was trying to protect her, but maybe I was protecting her from a danger that wasn't as real as I thought it was." As the months passed, James's condition gradually deteriorated. His good days became fewer and farther between, and during his bad days, he often didn't recognize his visitors or remember who they were. But on his good days, he was still able to share memories and express his love for his family. Margaret made good on her promise to visit regularly, and she often brought her children and grandchildren to meet their newly discovered grandfather and great-grandfather. James was amazed and delighted to learn about the large extended family that had grown from the seeds he and Eleanor had planted so many years ago. Sarah and Robert continued to visit whenever they could, and Sarah kept working on documenting the family's history. She was particularly focused on creating a comprehensive record of James and Eleanor's story that could be passed down to future generations. During one of their visits, Sarah brought James a scrapbook she had created that contained all of the photographs, letters, and documents she had found, along with new photos of the family reunion and written accounts of everyone's memories and stories. James spent hours looking through the scrapbook, marveling at the life he had missed and the family that had grown up without him. He was particularly moved by photographs of Eleanor throughout the years, watching her age and change while he remained frozen in his memories of her as a young woman. "She was beautiful her entire life," James said as he looked at a photograph of Eleanor taken just a few years before her death. "I can see the young woman I fell in love with in this old woman's face. Time changes our bodies, but it doesn't change who we are inside." The scrapbook also contained photographs of all the family members James had never met: his daughter-in-law, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren. He studied each face carefully, trying to memorize the features of family members he might not have much time left to get to know. As James's 98th birthday approached, the family decided to organize a celebration that would bring together as many family members as possible. Margaret's children and grandchildren flew in from various parts of California, and Sarah's extended family came down from Portland. The birthday celebration was held at the nursing home, with James surrounded by more than 20 family members he had never met before. Despite his declining health and increasing confusion, James seemed to understand the significance of the moment. During the celebration, Robert stood up to give a toast. 98 years ago, James Morrison was born, he said. For the first part of his life, he was our father and grandfather, the center of our family. For most of his life, he was John Martin, a man who lived in the shadows to keep us safe. But today, Robert continued, he's James Morrison again, surrounded by the family he sacrificed everything to protect. His love for us was so strong that he was willing to give up his own life to keep us safe. That's the kind of love that builds families and creates legacies. James smiled as he listened to Robert's toast, and for a moment, his eyes were clear and focused. "I may have lost 77 years with my family," he said in a voice that was stronger than it had been in months. "But I gained 77 years of knowing that my children and grandchildren were safe and happy. That was worth every day of loneliness." The birthday celebration was both joyful and bittersweet, as everyone present understood that it would likely be James's last birthday surrounded by family. His health was declining rapidly, and the doctors had warned that he probably had only a few months left. Over the next few weeks, family members took turns staying with James, making sure he was never alone and that he always had someone familiar nearby. Sarah took extended time off from work to be with him, and Margaret practically moved into the nursing home. During these final weeks, James had moments of startling clarity where he would share memories and stories that no one had heard before. He talked about his own parents, about his dreams and aspirations as a young man, about the early days of his relationship with Eleanor. James also spent time sharing wisdom and advice with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He talked about the importance of family, about protecting the people you love, and about never taking your relationships for granted. "Life is unpredictable," James told Sarah during one of their final conversations. "You never know when circumstances might separate you from the people you love, so make sure you tell them how you feel about them while you still can. Don't assume there will always be more time." James Morrison passed away peacefully on a quiet Tuesday morning in November, surrounded by his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. His last words were "Eleanor," spoken with a smile on his face, as if he could see her waiting for him. The funeral was a celebration of James's life and a testament to the power of family love that transcends time and separation. Family members came from all over the country to pay their respects to the man who had sacrificed everything to keep them safe. During the service, Margaret read for one of the letters James had written to Eleanor before his disappearance. "Love is not measured by the time we spend together, but by the depth of feeling that connects us across any distance and through any separation." Sarah gave a eulogy that focused on the incredible journey of discovery that had led them to find their lost family member. James Morrison taught us that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go, she said. He also taught us that love doesn't die just because people are separated. It lives on in our hearts and in our memories, waiting for the moment when we can be reunited. After the funeral, the extended family gathered at Margaret's house to share memories and stories about James and about the incredible sequence of events that had brought them all together. Everyone agreed that finding James had been like solving a mystery that had haunted the family for decades. In the months that followed James's death, Sarah continued to work on documenting the family's story. She interviewed every family member who had memories or stories to share, and she worked with a local historian to create a comprehensive account of the Morrison family saga. Sarah also began researching the criminal organization that had forced James into hiding, working with Detective Martinez to create a historical record of how organized crime in the 1940s had affected ordinary families like theirs. The research revealed that James's story was not unique. Many men during that era had been forced to disappear after getting entangled with criminal organizations. Most of these men had simply vanished without a trace, leaving their families to wonder forever what had happened to them. Sarah's documentation of her family's story became the foundation for a book about post-war organized crime and its impact on American families. The book, titled "The Man Behind the Wall: A Family's Search for Truth," was published 2 years after James's death. The book became a bestseller and sparked interest from other families who had experienced similar mysterious disappearances. Sarah began receiving letters from people all over the country who had family members who had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Decades earlier, Sarah also established a foundation dedicated to helping families search for missing relatives and to documenting the hidden history of how organized crime affected ordinary American families in the post-war era. The foundation was named the James Morrison Family Research Foundation. 1 year after James's death, the family held a memorial service at Eleanor's house in Portland. They unveiled a plaque in the backyard near the oak tree where Sarah had found the hidden documents commemorating James and Eleanor's love story and the family's incredible journey of discovery. The memorial service was attended by dozens of family members, including many who had never known about James until Sarah's discovery. The service included readings from James's letters, stories from family members, and the unveiling of a family tree that now included all of the branches that had been hidden for so many years. During the service, Robert reflected on how finding James had changed his understanding of his own life and identity. For 67 years, I thought I was Robert Mitchell, the son of William Mitchell, he said. But discovering my true heritage didn't diminish who I am. It enriched it. I now know that I am the product of two men who loved me. James Morrison, who gave me life, and William Mitchell, who raised me. Margaret spoke about how finding her family had filled a void that had existed in her heart for nearly 80 years. I spent my entire life feeling like something was missing, she said. Now I know that what was missing wasn't just knowledge about my past. It was connection to the people who share my blood and my history. Sarah talked about the lessons she had learned from her family's incredible journey. This experience taught me that families are more resilient than we think, she said. Love doesn't disappear just because people are separated. It waits patiently, sometimes for decades, until the right moment for reunion arrives. The memorial service concluded with the family burying a time capsule near the oak tree. The capsule contained letters from each family member to future generations, photographs documenting their reunion with James, and copies of the original documents that Sarah had found hidden behind the wall. As the sun set behind Eleanor's Victorian house, 4 generations of the Morrison family stood together in the backyard where James and Eleanor had once hidden their love. Letters as young sweethearts. The circle that had been broken in 1947 was finally complete again. Today, Sarah still lives in Eleanor's house, surrounded by the memories and mementos of her family's incredible story. The hidden alcove where she found the photograph has been restored and now contains a display of family artifacts that tell the story of James and Eleanor's love and separation. Margaret visits Portland several times a year, and she has developed a close relationship with Sarah and Robert that helps make up for the decades they lost. Margaret's children and grandchildren have also become close to their newly discovered extended family. A family portrait that started this incredible journey now hangs in a place of honor in Eleanor's living room, no longer hidden behind walls, but displayed proudly as a testament to the enduring power of family love. Next to it hangs a more recent photograph of the family reunion in Phoenix, showing 4 generations brought together by love, determination, and an old woman's refusal to throw away a mysterious photograph. Sarah often reflects on the chain of events that led to their incredible discovery. If Eleanor hadn't hidden that photograph behind the wall, if Sarah hadn't decided to renovate the living room, if she hadn't been curious enough to investigate what she had found, their family might never have been reunited. Sometimes I think Eleanor somehow knew that the photograph would be found after her death, Sarah says. Maybe she couldn't bring herself to reveal the secret while she was alive, but she made sure it would be discovered eventually. She made sure that James would be found and that our family would be whole again. The story of the Morrison family has inspired other families to dig deeper into their own histories and to question the official stories they've been told about missing or deceased relatives. Sarah's foundation has helped reunite dozens of families and has uncovered many other cases of men who were forced to disappear during the post-war era. Detective Martinez, who played a crucial role in helping the family find James, and Margaret has become something of a specialist in cold cases involving mysterious disappearances from the 1940s and 1950s. He credits the Morrison case with opening his eyes to a hidden aspect of American history that has been largely overlooked. The Morrison family's story has also been adapted into a documentary film and a television movie, bringing their incredible journey to audiences around the world. The film has sparked renewed interest in genealogy research and has encouraged many people to investigate their own family mysteries. But for Sarah, Robert, and Margaret, the most important outcome of their journey isn't the books, films, or media attention. It's the knowledge that their family is complete again, that the missing pieces of their puzzle have been found, and that James and Eleanor's love story, though interrupted by circumstances beyond their control, ultimately had a happy ending. We may have lost 77 years, Margaret reflects, but we gained something precious too. We gained the knowledge that love really is stronger than time, stronger, and separation stronger than fear. We learned that families can be broken apart, but never truly destroyed, as long as love remains. The oak tree in Eleanor's backyard still stands, now bearing a small plaque that reads, "In memory of James Morrison and Eleanor Morrison, whose love transcended time and distance, and whose family was made whole again through the power of truth and determination." As our story comes to an end, the Morrison family continues to grow and thrive. New babies are born, new marriages are celebrated, and new memories are made. But always at the center of it all is the knowledge that they are part of something larger than themselves. A family whose love was strong enough to survive decades of separation, and whose story proves that sometimes the most incredible truths are hidden in the most unexpected places. The photograph that started it all, that mysterious family portrait hidden behind a wall for decades, now serves as a reminder that every family has secrets, and that sometimes those secrets, when finally revealed, can bring healing instead of heartbreak. Sarah's advice to anyone who might be wondering about mysteries in their own family history is simple. Don't be afraid to dig deeper. Don't be satisfied with the surface story. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones that people worked the hardest to hide, not because they were shameful, but because revealing them might have been dangerous. And remember, Sarah adds, that love leaves traces, even when people are forced apart, even when circumstances make reunion impossible. Love finds ways to preserve itself in hidden photographs, in saved letters, in the memories that parents pass down to children, in the stories that get told and retold until they become family legend. The story of the Morrison family reminds us that history is not just about famous people and major events. It's also about ordinary families whose lives were shaped by extraordinary circumstances, whose love stories were interrupted but not destroyed, whose secrets were kept for decades until the right person came along to uncover the truth. As we reflect on this incredible journey of discovery, we're reminded that every old house has stories to tell, every family has mysteries to solve, and every photograph has the potential to reveal secrets that can change everything we thought we knew about our past. The Morrison family's story is ultimately about the triumph of love over fear, of truth over secrecy, and of family bonds over the forces that try to tear families apart. It's about a man who sacrificed everything to protect the people they loved, a woman who never stopped, believing in that love, and a granddaughter whose curiosity and determination brought them all back together again. So the next time you're cleaning out an old house, renovating a room, or going through a deceased relative's belongings, remember Sarah Mitchell and the photograph that changed everything. Look a little deeper, ask a few more questions, and don't be too quick to throw away things that seem mysterious or out of place. Because somewhere in your family's past, there might be a James Morrison waiting to be found, a love story waiting to be told, and a mystery that, once solved, will change your understanding of who you are and where you came from. This has been the incredible true story of the family portrait that revealed a 30-year secret, a secret that ultimately revealed itself to be not a source of shame or scandal, but the greatest love story any family could hope to have. Thank you for joining me on this remarkable journey of discovery. If this story has inspired you to look deeper into your own family's history, or if you have a family mystery of your own that you'd like to share, please let me know in the comments below. And remember to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more incredible true stories of family secrets, mysterious discoveries, and the amazing things that can happen when we refuse to let the past stay buried. Until next time, remember that every family has stories waiting to be discovered. And sometimes the most incredible truths are hiding in the most unexpected places, even behind the walls of the house where you grew up. Word count, approximately 7,500 words video length, approximately 53 minutes.